Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 665 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and this week we are excited to be revisiting our interview with Dr. Jennifer Jenkins, originally published on May 22nd of 2015. Listeners, Jenny's research aims to better understand emotion processes in children and in family life to shed light on psychopathology in children. She's internationally known for her research on family processes that promote lifelong learning and mental health in young children, as well as the study of resilience amongst siblings for children who are living in high-risk environments. So listeners, get ready to get inspired and to learn from Jenny in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Jenny Jenkins. So thank you so much for joining us, Jenny. How are you today?
I'm great. Nice to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you on the program, and I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So, listeners, let me tell you a little bit about Jenny. She is a professor in the Department of Human Development and Applied Psychology, as well as the Atkinson Chair of Early Child Development and Education, and Director of the Atkinson Center at the University of Toronto. She received her bachelor's degree in Developmental Psychology from the University of Sussex, her master's degree in Clinical Child Psychology from the University of Nottingham, and her PhD in psychology from the University of London. Afterwards, she worked as a senior clinical psychologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, and then as a lecturer at Stirling University, before joining the faculty at the University of Toronto, where she is today. And now, listeners, Jenny is here with us today to tell us about her journey through life and science. So today, Jenny, we want to get to know you, both scientifically and personally. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Let's see, just a little bit about my family. I have a daughter. She's now 26 years old. I have two stepsons who both live in London, in England. And there's my husband. That's my nuclear family. Then I have a very close group of friends that I've been friends with for over 30 years in and around the University of Toronto. So I guess those are the really important people to me and have helped me through my journey.
Well, wonderful to hear about the important people in your life, Jenny. So can you tell us, how do you spend your time with them when you're not doing science? Do you have any particular activities you like to do?
So I guess what I do is I'm a bit of an exercise fanatic and I run daily, and usually that's with my closest friend, a woman who's also a scientist at University of Toronto, and we chat about everything. We chat about science, we chat about our kids, we chat about politics at the university, and we're vigorously walking through Toronto for an hour every day.
The more heated the conversation, the faster you walk, perhaps.
That's right. That gives us a better workout.
Well, wonderful to hear about how you spend your time when you're not at work. Jenny, I know I myself am a bit of a power walker. Even when I'm just walking to a meeting, I tend to be going warp speed. So,
yeah, and that's difficult then for people who don't power walk.
Right.
You forget not to do it when you're with other people.
It almost feels like an awkward speed to walk normally. Well, wonderful to hear, like I said, about what you do when you're not doing science. And we're going to chat about your scientific side next. So can you tell us, how do you describe what you do at work to someone who might not be in science?
I teach at the University of Toronto, so I teach classes of students. I also have a large lab group, so that's about 6 or 7 master's and PhD students, and we all work together on projects. I love that group. I feel like I'm absolutely stimulated and intellectually fed by my students. One of the real pleasures of my career has been collaboration with my students. And what do we work on? We do our science. science, and that's about the influences on the development of mental health and early learning problems in children. And we think about biological risks for children of genetics and pre and perinatal risks and how those interface with and influence the family relationships that kids develop, and how those family relationships then go on to, in combination with those genetic and constitutional vulnerabilities, to really influence the mental health problems of kids. So we try and untangle all of those relationships by using longitudinal data and by using complex statistical models that pull those different parts of children's lives apart. We also work with people in policy and people in childcare and people in schools to try and make things easier for children, make their lives easier when they have these complex mental health and learning problems.
Well, Jenny, it sounds like you have just a lovely lab family that you've described and a really fascinating area of research with so much potential for having a big impact on these kids. I love it. And we'll talk more in detail about some of the work that you're doing. But first, I'd like to talk about motivation. I'm one of these people, I'm a quote person, I must say. So I love getting motivation and inspiration from our guests. So can you share with us, Jenny, your favorite motivational or inspirational quote?
George Eliot has been one of my favorite authors, and I love Middlemarch. And I guess it would be a quote from her which says, "What do we live for if not to make life less difficult for each other?" Why is that important to me? I guess the older I've got, the more that I've gone through life and watched my friends go through life, the more I realize how hard it is, how complex it is to make a life and have that come out okay and not have dreadful things happen. Of course, dreadful things do happen. And so we need to be with one another and help one another along that path. So that's why I'm so struck by her speaking about making life less difficult for each other.
Certainly. I think that is an excellent quote. And I think so many conversations I've had with people about their tough times, they've pointed to certain people who've helped them get through it. So I think this is a great point to bring up. Just the sort of people in your life who might be able to make your life less difficult is wonderful.
Well, it's that who's made my life easier and how I've been able to make other people's. But I've also, with children, one of the really striking things in the research that I do is that children's lives are buffered by having close relationships with a sibling or with a parent, somebody who helps them get through. That's why I'm partly really struck by that.
Definitely. Well, I love to hear how this applies to your life and the science that you do. And I'm curious to hear about some of the people who might have come along during your life, in your career, Jenny, to make life maybe a little less difficult for you or just inspired you along your journey.
There are a couple of people that I was really inspired by. One is a man called Philip Graham, who was my supervisor when I did my PhD, psychiatrist at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, where I began my career. And then another one was Michael Rudder, who was also a huge, towering person in developmental science around children. Both Philip and Michael had worked together on something called the Isle of Wight study, which was an epidemiological study of young children. It was really the first to look at the sort of normal patterns of illness in children's lives and what were the co-occurring factors that might influence the development of those problems, things about their families or their social circumstances. So what I loved and what I found so inspirational about both these men was the way that they reasoned with scientific data. So I loved the fact that you thought about what was influencing the development of these problems and what we should be doing about these problems in order to make the lives of children and families better. All of that was reasoned through data. I had more contact with Philip than I had with Mike because he was my supervisor, and he was also a boss of mine before I did my PhD, and just watching him reason around these issues so excited me that I thought, wow, I could have a life like that. So I asked him if he would supervise my PhD, and that was when I decided to go into research. Prior to that, I was working as a clinical psychologist, and it was just the excitement of how we could know something better. And once we knew it better, then we could do something about it that would really make sense. It's what people call evidence-based practice now. But in those days, it didn't quite have that term. And I just was very influenced by these men who thought in that way. I've subsequently been influenced by lots of women, but that was the start of it.
Certainly. Well, I think this excitement, this enthusiasm is contagious. And I think this data-driven logic or sort of evidence-based approach is really fundamental to science and something that people outside of science might not be as familiar with, but it is sort of, it sucks you in.
Sucks you in. Exactly right. Yeah.
Which is wonderful. So great to hear about some of these people who've had a big impact on you in your career and really driving you into the science and research element. But can you tell us now where this interest began? I mean, you mentioned you were sort of going the clinical route previously. Where did your interest in psychiatry, psychology begin?
I did psychology at university. I guess I was just captured then by how did people think, how did they learn, what influenced those patterns. I was always interested in individual differences. When I was in my own family, I was thinking, why am I like this and you're like that?
Am I going to turn into that later? Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps. So it was really from that I started thinking about reading psychology at university. And then once I was into that as an academic subject, I just loved it. One of the highlights of being in university was those days when I could just work in the library all day. I know that sounds not quite right, but
I too enjoyed a quiet library day. You're not alone.
It did feel good to me. Somehow that there's chaos in the world, but here you can tie things down.
Absolutely. You can hear yourself think, which is, I think, much appreciated in the university setting.
Yeah.
So can you tell us then how you went from this student kind of early asking these questions within this realm of science and psychology to where you are today? What really guided you? What were some of these key moments along your path that got you to your current position?
So when I worked as a clinician in London, there were quite a few people who were really influential. Philip Graham, who I mentioned, but also I was working in a department where we were doing a lot of family therapy, and the whole discipline of family therapy had just begun. And I started getting trained by people at Great Ormond Street Hospital in family therapy, and I found it absolutely riveting and totally interesting. And there was one person in particular, Judy Hildebrand, who was very influential on the development of my interest. She was so clear in being able to describe what happened in families and how to think about family interactions. So I worked clinically for a while, and it was really those years working clinically that spawned the rest of my career, because those interactions with families and trying to help families and trying to parse out family interactions and who was doing what to whom, who was influencing whom, really became what I've spent my life looking at in a scientific way. That was a very exciting period for me, and it was exciting to move from clinical work to really working that out in research work about how to measure things, how to assess things, how to observe, how to categorize, how to turn it into numbers, turn these complex phenomena into numbers.
Very interesting. And I like this idea that you're describing of this process of quantifying what you're observing clinically and really looking into the science of it. I think that is one of the exciting things that when I've talked to other clinicians going into research that they've mentioned as well. So very, very cool.
from an N of one to N of thousands now. So that's...
And being able to see those same patterns in then thousands of people, I think is really exciting. So it's not just that one sort of incidental phenomenon.
Exactly.
Well, we've gotten a few teasers about your research going through our conversation so far. But Jenny, next, I want you to unveil one of these projects that you are working on currently that you are the most excited about.
One of the things I'm working on at the moment is cooperation in relationships, is really how can people cooperate with one another? How do they know what is in each other's minds? How can they build on that and think about that and successfully interact on a joint endeavor, on a joint goal? So the way that I think about that with respect to children and families is we have these biological influences on us and we have these social influences on us. And I'm trying to parse out what an individual brings to a relationship and what the relationships create within the individual. So one of the ways that we do that is we take a brilliant idea, which was not mine. It was from somebody else called David Kenny, and it's something called the social relations model. And what he does is that he gets groups interacting. So it's called a round-robin design. So if we look at it in a family context, you look at one family member interacting with all the other family members, and you do that for each family member. What that allows you to pull out is what is consistent in how a person behaves across all of their different family members, and what do they consistently elicit from their different family members.
Interesting.
So if we take me and I'm interacting with you and my husband and my daughter, then first we can say, how is my behavior similar with each of you? But then we can say, what do I elicit from each of you? And is there something that I elicit that's the same? Let's look at across all of these family relationships, and we can say, what's similar in all of them? Is there anything that's similar? Is there a family that in that family, all of these relationships are cooperative with one another? They all know how to do this thing about reading other people's minds. Mm-hmm. How do they know how to do that? So that's what I'm looking at. And one of the things that we know from a recent study that we did was that there are these person effects, how we are positive and cooperate with one another. About 20% comes from a person, and then some of it comes from the family. But then a really interesting thing for me is that about 50% is specific to an individual dyad. So my relationship with you.
Interesting.
50%. So what that means to me is that the way that individuals react to one another is not prescribed in any way. So we can teach things like tolerance to other people and not being overly reactive to some irritating aspect of somebody. There isn't just an irritating family member and everybody is grumpy with that family member. That's not what happens. What happens is that one person's grumpy with that family member, but two others are not. So we can teach how to be non-reactive to things that can be a bit irritating about children. And I guess I mentioned that irritating aspect because we know that there are these biological influences on children. There are things that make kids more negative. There are genetic influences, there are pre- and perinatal influences, and they do make for mood problems in children. So when you take those into the family environment, those kids can be harder to parent. But we can do things about that. We can really help the parents and the siblings see those children in a different light. And that's sort of what I'm on about.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. And a lot of scientists do find it hard not to take their science home with them. And in your case, you're dissecting these very complex family relationships. So I have to ask, have you done this sort of analysis on your own family?
Of course. Of course. A lot of the work that I have, a lot of the influences have been from thinking about, well, how did that work in my own family? And then I'll take that into a more scientific way of looking at it. I'll think about something and conceptualize it and try and understand it better. And then I'll take it into hundreds of families to try and work out how that's happening.
Well, this is very interesting. So do you consider the dynamic nature of these relationships? I know a lot of people's sort of personalities, how they react to things change over time or perhaps at different ages. Are these difficult variables to control for?
You know, it absolutely is. And in the work that I do, we do longitudinal studies. So we do look at these patterns over time. But I have only done my science in about a 7 or 8 year framework. Some people have done longitudinal studies which have lasted for 30 or 35 years. Those people enormously. I won't be able to get that far before my career ends, so I feel some sadness in that. But they are dynamic, and the role of age, I think, is phenomenal in terms of the role of maturity over the life course. So I've lived that as a person, but I haven't been able to live that in my science, and that's something that I feel a little sad about.
Gotcha. Well, you'll have to pass that torch on to your successor in the scientific world. Wonderful to hear more about your research. And I think we've painted your adventure going through science as a very sunny, rosy experience. And I know it's so exciting to work in a variety of different fields of science right now. But I think there are dark days and challenges as well. And I would like to touch on those just to give our listeners a realistic picture of what it's like to go through a career in science. So Jenny, can you take us back to one of your challenging periods in your career or something that you struggled with or a major failure that you experienced, and tell us what happened and how you made it through to be successful?
There have been a few hard times, I think, in my career. I think the hard times in science are when you've done a project, you've done it for a few years, you've worked very hard on it, you've hypothesized something that does not come out. It doesn't work.
Right.
The project doesn't work. And that happens occasionally when you're just wrong. You went in thinking that one thing would happen.
You had this beautiful model, yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen. And you have to recover from that. You have to face that. You have to write that. You have to try and say what you think is happening. And so I've had a few of those in my career, and that's a challenge. But I guess the more significant things for me have been when I haven't got grants that I've applied for, jobs that I have really wanted when I was younger that would have made a big difference to me. Now, of course, in retrospect, you know that that's all fine, but in prospect, when you're going through it at the time and you really want that particular job and you don't get it, that's hard. I've watched those kinds of things with my students and postdocs, and those are just things that you have to live with. It's just what happens, but it is difficult. So you doubt your own competence, and it takes you a while to get up and running again and to think that really you are making a valuable contribution. But those can be low moments.
Definitely. So can you tell us how you respond or how you sort of recuperate after one of these maybe grant rejections or earlier on in your career, one of these job application rejections?
I was very lucky in having a wonderful mother who was one of those silver lining people.
That helps, yeah.
So she always had a way of framing a disappointment for the betterment of a person. This has happened, so this is how it's going to have a good impact on you in the future. So I loved that she could always turn something that was hard at the time. And, you know, both at the time she would say, it'll be okay, and this is how it'll turn out, or something like that. But also in retrospect, she would make sense of those things retrospectively. And it gave me a framework for thinking about my life, which I haven't forgotten, which has been really powerful and meaningful to me about these are always some kind of growth experience. So I think that's how I've thought about them, and I feel grateful to have had that perspective in my life.
Definitely. Well, I think it always helps to sort of get an outside perspective from someone who knows you well, someone like your mother who perhaps has a more optimistic view on life than you do at that moment where it feels like your world's crashing down. So
Exactly.
Wonderful to hear how you get through these tough times. But Jenny, next I want to talk success. So can you tell us about one of your own success stories? And this can be a big win or even just a little victory along the way.
Well, I guess a couple of things. One is this longitudinal study that I've been working on that I've had funding for since about 2004. It's hard to keep longitudinal studies going, and I've had a great team to do that with me. And so I guess that's been a big success for me. I love those data. I'm really thankful to the families that have taken part and stick with us. And it taught us so much. Funded my graduate students over the years and given them wonderful opportunities to develop their own passion for what they're doing. That's been a success. I guess the other thing is that I've been the Atkinson Chair of Early Development for about, 4 years now. And that's really enabled me to think about a whole trajectory of science, which is from research to practice and policy. And that's been important for me because I've really been a basic researcher. And so being the Atkinson Chair of Early Development has enabled me to think about what's the importance of this for the early education of children, what's the importance of this for how we interact with families, what's the importance of this for the mental health system that we need to set up for young children in order that they don't have problems later in their life. So it's really that whole trajectory from basic science to application in the world. And I've had the opportunity to work with terrific people around that because in the Atkinson Center, we have a policy fellow, we have an executive director who works on practice issues in the community. And that's been great for me because I really feel like, whoa, we're able to make a difference here.
Well, that is phenomenal. Congratulations on these successes, Jenny. These longitudinal studies, I think many people out there may not realize how challenging they are. Indeed, to be able to track people, like you said, up to 8 years, I think is just incredible. I think the longest study I've ever done is like 1 year, and even that's a challenge. So. So that is phenomenal. And I really like your description of this Atkinson chair position really being an opportunity for you to broaden almost your way of thinking about your work and the applications of it down the line. So that is wonderful. And we've talked a lot about the different opportunities that you get in science. And I think one of the ones we haven't touched on yet are some of the opportunities for travel. So we've talked about the different places you've gone for the different positions you've worked in. But can you think back now, Jenny, on all the places that you've been for science and tell us about your favorite place and what was it about this place that made it so memorable?
My most memorable event was going to give a talk in Helsinki, and the ash cloud descending from the volcano. I don't know if you remember a few years ago.
Yeah. Was that 2010 or so, maybe?
We needed to get back for a big family event.
Oh, no.
And the ash cloud descended, and so we couldn't get our flight out. We kept trying, like there were moments of it opening up and a flight would leave, but we wouldn't be on it.
Everyone would be scrambling to it. Yeah.
Right, we'd be running to try and get on it, but it would be full. So then we made a mad rush down to Southern Europe to try and get a flight back from there. And that was, in fact, quite a lot of fun because we took trains down. We met lots of other people trying to do the same thing. It had a sort of crisis quality.
Unifying effect, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. So people were very open about all their travel arrangements and what they needed to be getting back for and stuff. And so we had tremendous fun. I remember traveling through the night, changing planes in very exotic places. in Europe and standing on station platforms, but it was all exciting. So I really loved it.
Well, you've almost made it sound like this could be a movie, I think. Fantastic story to share. And I think this sounds like a just phenomenal adventure, being able to travel through all these different places in Europe. Maybe not to get to see the sites, you're sort of stuck in airports and train stations, but still very, very cool experience. So Did you make it in time for your big family event?
We did.
Well, congratulations on that success.
We did.
Well, that is wonderful. And I think a lot of these travel opportunities for science, there are great chances for scientists to get together, to bond over the science, but also sort of these just human bonding experiences of being in a different place with people, having the same goals, going through the same thing. So very, very good example there. And one of the things we like to do on our program, in addition to talking about travel, talking about research, is talking about books. I know I'm a bit of a bookworm myself. So can you give us today, Jenny, a book recommendation of something that you read and really enjoyed? This can be science or not science, whatever you prefer.
I think I've got to give you two.
That's fair.
So one is A Natural History. That's by my husband, Keith Oatley. Keith is both a psychologist and a novelist. And the thing that I loved about that was that it is a depiction of a scientist, of an epidemiologist who's thinking through the cause of cholera. So because I was trained as an epidemiologist, and that's always a love that Keith and I have shared, and then he turned it into a novel because he's incredibly good at creative endeavors, which I am not, except the creativity in my science, but not creativity.
Science is creative. It counts. Yeah.
Yeah, but it has a different quality to it when you watch somebody writing a novel. So anyway, it was the depiction of a scientist and how a scientist thinks that I really loved about that. And then I guess the other one that I've read quite recently was a book called Stoner by John Williams. And that I loved because it really shows a whole of a life trajectory. It happens to be an academic, but that's not particularly relevant. And there were two things depicted in that I thought were magnificent. And one of them was that Stoner has an absolutely ordinary life. He's one of, the billion of people in the world, and it's an ordinary life. He's born, he works hard, he has a family, and he dies. And that's what the novel's about.
That's what most of us can look forward to, right?
But then on the other hand, it also, what it does such an amazing job of is showing you the importance of that life to that man, the depth of his individual experience. But it is ultimately, like everybody's life, an ordinary life. So I love the juxtaposition of those two ideas. I just thought it was phenomenal.
Well, these both sound like incredible book recommendations. I'll put them out on our website for our listeners to find there if they're looking for their next great read. And I really like that both of these books that you mentioned are really stories of people and kind of getting inside the minds and lives of people. And I think this is one of the things that I love about our show is being able to talk to people, kind of get an inside view into their own lives, and particularly kind of showing the world the inside look into science. And it's one of the things that we love to do is break the stereotypes. So I think scientists in the media are often portrayed in a certain way. And we like to show that there's a lighter side of science. And particularly there's some of these traditions that show up in different laboratories with groups of brilliant, funny, wonderful people working together, and just some excellent memories that you share together and great relationships that you form. So can you tell us today, Jenny, about one of these traditions that you've experienced at some point in your career, or even just a funny science memory that you shared with some of your colleagues?
I'd probably have to go to my lab on that one. So we're always trying to work stuff out. We'll go out for a drink or meal. We'll get excited. We'll be talking about something just in our lives, but then it'll link up to something we've been worrying about in our science. And suddenly we're off on drawing these models on the back of napkins in pubs and stuff. And that's one of the things that I love it when my students get excited and they're scrabbling in their bags just to get a bit of paper out so that we can draw it and see what this looks like. And I've got terrific students and they love sort of thinking about what the figure will look like.
Right. Got to plan that paper.
Right. Exactly. I also love it how they moved a couch into the lab space a few years back so that they could stay longer and later.
I like it. That's forward thinking right there.
Have a little sleep and then, get back up again. And so I love that.
Well, that is wonderful. It sounds like you have cultivated just a superb lab environment there. And I love this idea of sort of getting so animated and excited when you're in a restaurant or a pub or wherever it might be. And I know I'm one of these hand gestury sorts of people, but you get to a point where you just need to have a pen and a paper and get some of these ideas down. So wonderful to hear about your lab and a little bit about some of the experiences there. And I think in addition to working with brilliant people, you get to talk about the exciting research and you get to talk about these big questions that maybe you're a step or two away from answering. So I love hearing about the big questions that are in scientists' mind today. Can you tell us, Jenny, if we gave you everything, if things like funding and staff, technology, feasibility, not an issue, what is the question that you would want to answer?
I guess it would be this question that I was talking about before, which I'm going to be able to answer in a limited way. What does a person bring to a relationship, and what does that relationship bring to a person over a life course? So what I'd really love to do is to videotape families, all families, everybody interacting with everybody else so that I can get this person effect that I described to you before, as well as I want to know all of their genetic backgrounds so that I want to be able to look at these genome-wide association studies where you'd have all of the genes. I want to be able to do that on thousands of people, and I want to be able to do that over time. I guess that's what, for me, it would be a clincher. It'll never happen. It's far too complicated. It means way, way too much money. But I now deeply believe in these genetic influences on behavior, but I also believe in the interface with the environment and the way in which that environment affects that genetic expression. And for that to happen, I would need many, many thousands of families and children, but that would be a dream.
Well, very, very cool project. I like that you have some of the details worked out already. This sounds like one of these projects that not only is it difficult to just get the data, you have thousands of families videotaping them all the time, but then what do you do when you have all that data? All these hours and hours of videos plus all of the genetic information. Is this something that you struggle with now? Basically distilling all of this data into a meaningful message or meaningful patterns?
Not really, because what you do is you carve out a bit of that. So we know the things that we're looking for in families. We know the processes that are advantageous and disadvantageous for children. So we know how to go in and look at a videotape and pull out what it is we need from that videotape. And that's because of the science of looking at relationships over 50, 60 years. So we build on one another's science, and we know how to go in and parse these complex phenomena with respect to interactions. And then we also know big data. We're developing fabulous techniques in big data now. So we also know how to say, okay, I want to look at this relationship. How do we do it when we have lots of data points around family interactions? We have some genetic influences here. So how do we do that? And people in these different fields, I collaborate a lot. I collaborate with geneticists. I collaborate with people who do complex statistical work. And so they know how to do their particular bit of the parsing that takes us a little bit further.
Well, wonderful to hear about one of your dream projects. And I think definitely an exciting potential endeavor. Maybe if you can even get some of those pieces together, as you said, being able to answer part of that question in your lifetime. So very, very cool, Jenny. And I think not only do scientists get opportunities to answer these thrilling research questions, but you also get a lot of great mentors and great advice along your journey. So can you share with us today, what is the one piece of advice that you would consider the best pearl of wisdom you have ever received?
I guess there were probably two things. One was enjoying the process rather than the outcome. I have done things which I have thought were just great scientifically, and those have not necessarily been the things that have been taken up in the scientific community at all. But they're the ones that I feel have been really important to do. So you have to love the process. You have to love the process of asking and answering a question, which you well know, because as you're talking, I can hear that that's been something that you have also been gripped by. So that process is the issue. And then I guess the other thing is, over the course of a scientific trajectory, you've moved from working under people to being the one who's managing the lab and who's running the lab. And that's a difficult transition. When you work under people, people are telling you, oh, you're doing a great job, this is terrific. And then you have to do it all yourself. And so I remember one of my mentors picking up on that as I was moving through that process of moving from being a young junior researcher to a more senior one. And it was very helpful when he described that process. And now I was in the life stage where I just needed to be a boss. And that was helpful for me.
Definitely. I think that transition is difficult for a lot of scientists who are used to having those senior mentors in place. And then maybe you're at a completely new institution. I mean, you're still going to be finding mentors to help you with different aspects of your career, but so much more of it is all on you. And you are the boss, like you said, which is sort of exciting but terrifying at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, Jenny, wonderful to hear some of these pearls of wisdom that you've received over the years that have been very helpful. And is there any last piece of advice, or maybe one last piece of inspiration that you want to share with our listeners today now, coming from you?
My commitment for a long time has just been to junior researchers. And so I guess it's really just to love the process of building your questions and take pleasure in that. And for me, this wouldn't be true for all scientists, but I started as a clinical psychologist, really love the process of finding these things out and finding ways to get it into bettering the lives of children, really. So get it into the world, think about the applications, and really work out what it is that kids and families need to be supported.
Definitely. Well, I think the curiosity, the passion helps you get through some of these perhaps duller or more painful parts of the process.
There are dull moments in the whole business.
There are more than I think you would expect going in, but the passion and the curiosity makes it all worth it. Well, Jenny, I have really enjoyed our conversation today. Can you tell our listeners how they can reach out to learn more about you or your research?
They can go on our website. We have the Atkinson Center website, which they can just Google, the Jenkins Lab website, and that'll give you all of the papers that I write with my students. And they can contact me on email if people have any questions following this.
Excellent. Well, Jenny, thank you again so much for chatting with us today. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Certainly. And thank you to our listeners out there. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.